Your whole life is just a dream.
I am immortal.
I think you have been afraid all your life. Now open your mind to me.
It's a dream.
You have always been here.
It's a dream.
Hey there. This is AM by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow your mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in. Always broadcast through, you got it, the God above God that can.
Sticking feathers up your butt does not make you a chicken.
This is your life, and it's ending 1 minute at a time.
It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything.
Ah, so glad you have incarnated at the virtual Alexandria. As the year ends, materialism conquers and the solstice surges. On this late December, the year of our Demiurge 2017. By Odin's dingleberries, Saturn is being crueler than usual with fast-moving seasons and the pain of flesh and the devouring of all sanity from this world of tragedy and hope. But we continue with our triumphant awakening, and you might call this a special show. We will be dealing with the secret book of John, a text from the Nag Hammadi library many scholars consider the complete Gnostic text. It's got it all, from Sophia to the Demiurge, from Gnosis to the divine feminine, from cosmic rebellion to a psychedelic eschatology. As some scholars have said, it's truly the first Abrahamic text to have that, quote, history of salvation vibe, where the reader witnesses the pre-creation story and the end of time, as if riding a TARDIS. It's surreal, meta, Lovecraftian at times, and truly an epic outside of time and space and your own mind. One of my favorite texts. I felt it important to cover an overview, one more Saturn cycle, on this fearsome holiday season.
You know what I'm going to get you next Christmas? A big wooden cross. So every time you feel unappreciated for all your sacrifices, you can climb on up and nail yourself to it.
Did I forget to replace all the Kevin Spacey clips with a Christopher Plummer voice? Gotta get to this.
I think you just became my personal hero.
Anywho, our episode is a rerun, but not really a rerun. You'll actually get the sapience of not one, but three of today's greatest minds on the Gnostics and alternative Christianity. And you can find all of their transcripts in my book, Voices of Gnosticism. The first part is with Stevan Davies, author of The Secret Book of John, the Gnostic Gospel. A short but amazing book that inspires and educates to high levels. Thanks to the audio wizardry of our producer, the Moondog Vance, my old interview with him has been restored. The audio was a mess, as we spoke many moons ago when podcasting was pretty new and pretty unreliable. There's this ugly copy in the archive, but I wanted to bring it back now in a much, much better incarnation. Sure, there is some overlap, and it's not exactly Dolby audio, but it's very listenable, and I think you'll really get a lot out of it, including Stevan's speculation that it was Western religion that shaped Eastern mysticism, and not vice versa as many assume.
What does that mean, Buddha? If I don't finish my meditation, I tend to get a little cranky.
After that, I will play a clip from Karen King, who also wrote a remarkable book on the secret book of John. In our interview, we focus on the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas. But there is a section where King addresses the secret book of John. She makes a case that this text, coming from the surly and antinomian Sethians, actually promotes family values and a love for the universe. And it's a sound case. You'll be amazed, I feel.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
Our third interview will be for members. It's with John Turner, arguably the greatest authority on the Sethian since, well, the Sethians themselves. Turner's mind is like a cosmos in itself, pure brilliance. And I did have the honor to meet him at the Gnostic Counterculture Conference at Rice University a few years ago. He is very down-to-earth, funny, and dynamic, and we shared plenty of coffee, cigarettes, and gnosis together. Among many revelations, Turner makes the case that the secret book of John is a mixture of different Gnostic sects. The Ophites, or serpent worshippers, writing about the Garden of Eden. The Sethian speaking about the pre-cosmic reality of the alien god, and so forth. And we discuss the potential pre-Christian origins of this gospel and the mystical community behind it. Bigly Gnosis.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
Again, you can find these interviews in Voices of Gnosticism, as well as on YouTube and the member section. But here, you will get them in one infernal enchilada, streamlined and improved, all to grok the mercurial but liberating mystery that is the secret book of John. I hope you enjoy, because your awakening wakes me up, you see. Let me know what you think of this little departure, and get ready for some mind-expanding, reality-dispanding guests before the dying 2017 and in 2018. All the illusion of Saturn anyway.
Source code is not time travel. Rather, source code is time reassignment.
I won't go into my pitch of becoming a member, but if you want the whole show and other benefits, please go to, thegodabovegod.com. Your support is essential, and I really appreciate you Aram Czech Avengers and Knights of Valis who support on a weekly basis. Thank you, and thank you for being here. Of course, if you have holes in your pockets and the Archons are cruel, just let me know, and I'll send you any show you want. So don't forget, we start with Stevan Davies, go to Karen King, and then, for members and patrons at Patreon, a spanning interview with John Turner, who also happens to be a chief translator of the Nag Hammadi Library. And don't forget that the Gnostics saw Jesus as a theoretical Christ, the creative logos of the divine trying to figure out better realities, a force of myth behind mundane history, a daemon at the apex of your mind. Like Stevan Davies says, the Savior is not a celestial being brought to earth. The Savior is a capacity of the mind, and the Savior's journey from above is actually one's own insight journeying from within.
Who am I? That's the real question, isn't it? Who am I? Who are you? What other questions are there? What other questions are there, really? If you want to understand the universe, embrace the universe, the door to the universe is you.
And I like what Vance recently told me about Jesus and time, or Saturn. Jesus is a signal. There is no real proof of a singular common past, however compelling it may seem. That signal is not limited to any one story or past. The importance of Jesus or any other teaching character from, quote, the past is how it advances you. Nothing in the past is physically real. It all exists only as manifestations of propagated signals in each of our minds. Sherlock Holmes is just as real now as George Washington in terms of the effects of each living person. Words, symbols, concepts, archetypes, myth, none is ultimately absolutely real or true except in a context of agreement/convention. Reality is a trickster. You can prove something with available evidence, quote, from the past, but always now in memory storage recirculated. Then one little new discovery can enter the belief system and change everything.
Who knows? I may pick up a rock and it'll say underneath, made by God. The universe is full of surprises.
So have fun reconstructing, but don't lose sight that we're all watching a master illusion, produced by a trickster, whose exposition can instantly switch at a moment's notice. Within this context, our myths live, grow, develop, and change. And yes, Jesus is himself an archon-countering, shape-shifting trickster in the secret book of John and other Gnostic texts. In your own life, an aspect of Hermes that is part of the war against Saturn. To understand him, like the Gnostics, yes, write your own gospel and live your own myth.
Strange indeed that you should not have suspected that your universe and its contents were only dreams, visions, fiction. Strange, because they are so frankly and hysterically insane, like all dreams. A God who could make good children as easily as bad, yet preferred to make bad ones, who could have made every one of them happy, yet never made a single happy one, who made them prize their bitter life, yet stingingly cut it short, who gave his angels eternal happiness unearned, yet required his other children to earn it, who gave his angels painless lives, yet cursed his other children with biting miseries and maladies of mind and body, who mouths justice and invented hell, mouths mercy and invented hell, mouths golden rules and forgiveness multiplied by 70 times 7 and invented hell, who mouths morals to other people and has none himself, who frowns upon crimes yet commits them all, who created man without invitation, then tries to shuffle the responsibility for man's acts upon man, instead of honorably placing it where it belongs, upon himself. And finally, with altogether divine obtuseness, invites this poor abused slave to worship him. You perceive now that these things are all impossible except in a dream. You perceive that they are pure and puerile insanities, the silly creations of an imagination that is not conscious of its freaks. In a word, that they are a dream, and you the maker of it. The dream marks are all present. You should have recognized them earlier.
The question I've been asking my previous guests, of course, since there's a lot of lay people who will be listening in, is could you give us a short, easy-to-understand definition of Gnosticism and perhaps Gnosis? You know, the kind of question you would be asked, let's say you're at an airport and somebody comes up to you and say, Professor Davis, you have 20 minutes to get on the plane. Can you tell me what Gnosticism is
one
about?
Sentence. I was just thinking that Gnosticism is about discovering the way that God turned into you, and then realizing that if you can describe how it is that God turned into you, you can reverse the process. I think that's what.
That's a really good answer. It's the famous "the way of ascent."
Yeah, that's actually in the secret book of John. That quotation. If you understand how the problem arose of the spirit being trapped in a human body in the world, if you understand that, then you can reverse the process.
So
that seems to be the reason why they're so obsessed with creation mythologies. It's not for its own sake, just speculating about how the world came into being, but with the idea that you would want to reverse it and send the world back to God where it came from.
So the salvation is basically finding the knowledge to get.
I think that's true. I mean, some have said, well, the knowledge that Gnosis is called really relates to the fact or the theory that your spirit is a divine spirit. But it's more than that. It's not just realizing that that's the case, it's knowing how that came to be the case that they seem most interested.
And you think that, or the Gnostics decided, well, do you think that they had secret information about the book of Genesis, or they decided we're just going to take it and rewrite it in a mythological way?
Religions love to have secrets. If you look at books in the New Age series in your local bookstore, half of them have secrets and mysteries in the title. And half the Gnostic stuff has secrets and mysteries in the title. But even in the canonical Gospels, Jesus is talking about the mystery of the kingdom of God. And the TV channels like the Discovery Channel, everything's the mystery of this and the secret of that. So I think that the idea of secret knowledge was as appealing then as it is now. But I really don't think it was secret. I think that they publicized their beliefs. They certainly wrote obsessively about them. They seem to have an awful lot of different pieces of literature that they put up.
But isn't the rule that cannot be broken in Judaism is that you cannot change the Torah, or do you see this, the secret book of John, as a midrash?
What I think
is that how they sold it?
They, whoever put the secret book of John together, believed in the basic mythology of the Jews. Believed that the structure you find in the Genesis story was correct. But they looked on Moses as an interpreter of the story. And they don't think he was right. So it's a funny thing. They're not looking at Genesis as the book of Moses and somehow, therefore, Moses was the infallible interpreter. The story is right, but Moses' interpretation is wrong. See, several times in the secret book of John, it's saying, not as Moses said, but. So it's giving you a different view, but it's a different view of the same story.
But in the book, you say that the book was first a Jewish work and then was later Christian.
At least it was well, it's a big debate as to whether you could say it was Jewish or was it anti-Jewish. I think that the only people in the world who really had a serious concern for the Torah were Jewish people. So I really don't envision it a bunch of pagan people or non-Jewish people suddenly getting obsessed by revising the Jewish scriptures. I think Jewish people worked with the Jewish scriptures. You get a book like the Secret Book of John, it's rather clear that the basic structure and story doesn't have anything to do with the Christian story. That there's a frame put around it. The beginning of the book is a frame putting it in the context of Jesus talking to John. And then the conclusion of the book sort of returns to that frame and concludes with Jesus talking to John. And that makes it a thing relevant to Christianity. But the basic book isn't really Christian at all.
Yeah, that is true. And in fact, something you pointed out, which was amazing, was the name of the Pharisee that John meets at the beginning sounds very much like the evil god of the Persians. Aruman.
In terms of reading that theory, if you look at the book, the letter of James in the New Testament, the letter of James, which is a fairly long piece of writing, is entirely a Jewish sermon about doing good and helping others, and very reasonable moral writings. But there's nothing Christian about that either. There's really only two sentences. The first sentence of it, and what is now the first sentence of section 2 of chapter 2 of the letter of James. I think that's another example of a piece of Jewish writing that was Christianized by adding a framework around it. Two sentences were added with the word Jesus Christ in them, and now you have a Christian doctrine. But the contents of it were not originally written by a Christian person. Probably written by a rabbi either roughly the time of Jesus.
Why do you think the church would have been attracted to such a Jewish piece of work?
Nothing specifically Jewish or Christian about it. I mean, the specific Christian vocabulary is showing up in just two places. The ideas of it would be acceptable to both religions. But now, the secret Gospel of John seems to be something that was in existence before Christianity, or at least there's another big issue as to whether it's chronologically prior to Christianity or just ideologically prior. In other words, it's pretty clear that the basic Gnostic myth existed. The Christians took it and adapted it to Christianity. So you do sort of have a chronological sequence. But did the basic Gnostic myth exist before Christianity existed is a different question.
Oh, that makes sense.
And that's where the debate is. There's no evidence that there was Gnosticism before there was Christianity, but to some degree common sense leads one to suspect maybe there was any.
And what would be the dating of the secret book of John? I know in your book you mentioned that it was probably a Jewish Gnostic work written towards the end of the 1st century and then later Christianized. When did this happen?
The Christianization of it, when this framework is added to it, and a few Christian elements pop in the middle of it, added by scribes, maybe that's happening, towards the 130, 140, early 7th century. But this is all just speculation. If somebody dug up a copy of it in Greek with a date of 50 BC, I wouldn't be surprised. But right now, there's no evidence to support that date.
And wasn't the gospel, or the first time we hear about the secret book of John, is by Bishop Irenaeus around 180 AD, which is basically the first time we hear about the canonical Gospels and the Gospel of Judas.
Something I was looking into, and it's not as clear as people say it is, that the Gospel of Judas is mentioned by Irenaeus. In other words, if you've got a Gospel of Judas manuscript, and Irenaeus mentions Gospel of Judas, you naturally think, well, A equals A, but not so fast. The way he describes the Gospel of Judas doesn't really look like this manuscript.
Oh, I see.
And I kind of suspect there were more than one document called the Gospel of Judas.
Really?
Maybe Irenaeus is talking about something else.
Oh,
no,
wow,
I suspect the Gospel of Judas was the one we have recently discovered. May have been written at the end of the 2nd century. So it really doesn't make a lot of difference if Irenaeus. But I kind of suspect it does. Something else by the same time.
You're obviously well known by your expertise in the Gospel of Thomas, shown by your book, The Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom. What would you say is the dating for the Gospel of Thomas?
Non-committed Christians like myself, or people who are not affiliated with the Christian church particularly, tend to date it a bit earlier, somewhere between 70, even 60, which is more or less where I would put it, and say 90 AD. Either late middle or end of the 1st century. The people who are more evangelical, more biblically oriented, more church-based, tend to be trying to date it towards the, say, 130, 140 period. So that it becomes a bit of an ideological struggle to say, the biblically Christian scholars, seem to be very threatened by the idea that Jesus' traditions could be in existence that are not in the Bible. And the Bible should be everything we know. And an effort is made to argue that Thomas, therefore, the only information in Thomas worth anything Thomas took out of the Bible. And therefore, it's irrelevant, really, for knowledge of Jesus. The others, including myself, would say Thomas has a fairly decent claim to be about as authoritative as the biblical books. Some of it's true and authentic Jesus material, some of it isn't, and it needs to be sorted out, but you can't. I would say it's wrong to say Thomas is simply dependent on the New Testament and therefore without significant value.
Would you consider the Gospel of Thomas a Gnostic Gospel or some sort of a Q document or Q Gospel?
I don't think it's a Gnostic, right? that it has to do with the descent of God into this world and God being trapped in this world and having to return out of this world with a definite negative valuation on this world. Thomas doesn't have anything like that. In fact, Thomas contradicts that. Thomas talks about the presence of the kingdom of God in the world. But the kingdom is here, the kingdom is now, the kingdom is within you. There's none of the Gnostic opposition to the world and concern with the cosmology of it. So frankly, I don't think it's not.
That is true, but at the same time, the secret book of John, what I liked about it is you put a very positive view on it, because you write, you show us there is a plan set in place, everything's okay throughout the whole mythology, even of the flood and the creation of Adam. So if you look at the secret book of John, there is a kind of reassurance that there is a
rescue effort going on.
You could say that.
So somebody has fallen overboard into the Bering Sea and has to be dragged out. Well, that's what's happened to the Spirit of God, has fallen into this world and has to be dragged out. And then it becomes, in Gnosticism, somewhat questionable as to whether this world exists at all. I mean, if the world is made by a mistake on the part of God, the wisdom of God has mistakenly brought it into being, then as soon as we realize the erroneous nature of the world, it vanishes. This is stated very nicely in the Gospel of Truth. That once you realize the truth, the error just disappears. And the world, the physical world, is an error. And as soon as you realize the truth, poof, the error is gone. Which relates to some degree to the Advaita Vedanta philosophy of Hinduism, that the world's an illusion.
Oh, I see.
So if the Gospel of Thomas isn't Gnostic in the same way as the secret book of John is, what is it really about? I mean, is it another kingdom of God sect, or where did they get their ideas from exactly?
At least the first couple chapters of Genesis. The first chapter is the 7 days chapter, and God says everything is good and everything's just wonderful. And then God rests. No problems. Chapter 2 is a different creation story from a different tradition. And that contains the fall and the mistake and Adam's being driven out of the garden and Eve's being driven out of the garden. So you have two creation stories. Well, whatever happened to the first creation? Now, this is a good, legitimate Jewish mythological question. If you have man made in the image of God, and then chapter 2, man is made of the earth and falls into sin, what happened to the image of God? It didn't just cease to exist. Well, I think the Thomas people, the Thomas Christians, were saying that the first week of creation, the perfect creation, continues to exist forever. And that's the kingdom of God. And people don't know it's there. So the goal of the secret knowledge, so to speak, in Thomas is to discover the presence of the kingdom of God in the world, which has been hidden there in the beginning, and is still there.
So what you're saying is, or what I'm reading into, is that it's possible that first chapter of Genesis might have been handed down orally or brought down from another kingdom other than Judea.
We're taught from birth, practically in Sunday school, Christians are, that Jesus is Jewish and that Jesus is Galilean. Well, the Jewish people, that comes from the word for Judea. Judea is a different country than Galilee.
Mm-hmm.
So the simple idea, well, Jesus is Judean, no, he's not Judean, he's from Galilee. And Galilee borders on Syria to the north, which has rather different function. So I suspect Jesus is influenced by Syrian culture in the north, as well as Judean culture to the south. And that the Thomas traditions may be coming in more from the Syrian way of thinking than the Judean way of thinking.
And can you tell us about this Galilean/Syrian worldview or religion?
People are made in the image of God from the beginning and can recapture that image state. It's much less focused on the fall and sin and, the need for retribution and so forth. Much more on the idea of human beings being divinized. So it tends to connect a bit to the Gnostic tradition. The question that separates the Thomas ideology from the Secret Book of John ideology is about the nature of the world.
Yes,
is the world a cosmic mistake filled with demons, which is the Secret Book of John notion? Or is the world the good place of the first 7 days of creation, is a Gospel of Thomas notion? And those are pretty different ideas. But the idea of human beings being inherently divine, that they seem to share.
But the Syrian and obviously the Gnostic ideology, they sound very Eastern, very Hindu. Do you think that both of these schools of thought were influenced by the East?
If you look at the chronological problem, the Gnostic ideas that do seem similar to Vaidavadanta Hinduism or Vajrayana Buddhism or Yogacara Buddhism, they're earlier chronologically than those Eastern movements. So if there was an influence, chronologically speaking, it would have to be from the Gnostics on the Hindus and Buddhists, rather than vice versa.
Yeah, I guess we're so conditioned here to assume that the East has always influenced the West, or that it is a far older tradition. But, now that I think about it, Mahayana Buddhism didn't start till the end of the 1st century. And, after Alexander the Great conquered the world, there is certainly evidence that the world shrunk and became sort of internet where everything passed. Lots of evidence, isn't there?
There's lots of Roman coins found in southern India. And there's reports of Brahmin teachers teaching in Egypt. They're called the naked philosophers, Brahmin teachers, but they're from India.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So there really was a fair amount of contact between them.
Wow, this is certainly something to look into more, kind of like the AC/DC song, Who Made Who? But what would you say are some of the Gnostic imprints on the canonical Bible we know today?
Jesus says, do not look here, do not look there, don't look in these outward places, for the kingdom of heaven is within you. Now that's a very Gospel of Thomas idea. But there's not much else. It seems to be pretty clearly separated. Because the basic ideologies of the canonical Gospel writers were just not Gnostic. So they weren't picking up Gnostic materials and putting it in books.
Well, wasn't the Gospel of John originally a Gnostic work, or did they just revere it first before Orthodox Christianity got a hold of it?
It was their favorite one. In John's Gospel, it's hard to see Jesus as a human being almost. Now, Orthodox Christianity makes a big point of saying, well, he was human, and look, in the Gospel of John it says the Word was made flesh, and dwelt within us. To emphasize that word flesh, which the Gospel of Thomas also uses the word flesh for Jesus. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus repeatedly says, I am not of this world. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I have come into this world. So the Gnostics found that kind of motif very congenial to their own ideas.
Shifting forwards in the Bible, well, actually shifting backwards chronologically, could you say, or would you say that Paul might be considered a Gnostic or proto-Gnostic, if you will? And if not, what are his influences on Christianity as we know it?
Essentially created it. Well, I should not begin to that. But he certainly wrote the letters that became the basis of our theology ever since. But I don't really see much Gnosticism. And to say he's opposing Gnosticism, I don't see it. I just never have seen it. I've read a book or two of some people arguing that say in Corinthians, he's arguing with Gnostics. They really think this.
Is it fair to say that there's an argument for believing that Paul might have begun a sort of Jewish mystery religion?
I think so. And a lot of, one of the funny things that I'm not sure what to make of is that we tend to think of Jesus
as a
fully human picture of moral principles and so forth. And somehow, very early on, Christianity turns into this mystery religion, worshiping a God who's come down from heaven named Jesus, who dies as a sacrifice for sins. And all of these humble teachings are no longer centrally important, certainly Paul doesn't. So people, as a rule, like to say that Paul invented this whole new kind of Christianity. Well, it's fine so far, but Paul doesn't think he's inventing anything. He thinks he's joining the movement. And he gives a little biography at the beginning of Galatians, where he says, I used to persecute these churches, and there's churches in Judea and so forth, churches of God in Judea. But then, he had his conversion experience going to Damascus, and suddenly he's joining these churches. So it struck me that, we scholars spend our time saying, well, Paul invented this, Paul invented this. But Paul doesn't think he invented anything. Paul thinks there was an existing movement, and he joined it. And this movement is a movement containing churches up and down Judea, all the way down to Damascus. And this is in existence within 2 or 3 years after Jesus dies, which is when Paul was doing his first. So this is all just a puzzle. Where did this network of churches come from? It seems that Jesus left behind him a much more organized network of churches than he's usually given credit for. And this is the movement that Paul believes is doing. Could be that this view of a cosmic Christ that Paul has wasn't Paul's invention, but existed before Paul.
So if you think that Paul isn't Gnostic, why were his epistles so attractive to the arguably Gnostic and heretical Marcion?
It identifies the secondary and inferior God, is Geldebeon. Identifies him with the God of Jews, the Old Testament God. And so the God of the Jews is seen to be oppressing people and literally destroying the world through floods and so forth, and creating a law that oppresses people. And I think Marcion saw that. And so when Marcion's reading Paul, he sees that Paul is opposed to the Jewish law. This idea of God as a lawgiver trying to confine humanity to these legal principles. And Marcion and Paul seem to agree that this is wrong. So I suspect in that sense, Marcion saw Paul as an ally. But that Paul's opposition to the law, in Marcion's mind, correlated with Marcion's opposition to the Jewish God. Now, Paul wouldn't have agreed with that for a minute. But Marcion's in charge of Marcion's thought. Paul is. Paul was very, very, very nervous about his own opposition. Yeah, because
Marcion wanted to get rid of any Jewish vestiges of in his works.
Marcion was completely in opposition to the Jewish God himself. Paul would not want.
We touched upon the Gospel of Judas earlier in the interview. Have you had a chance to read it? And if you have, what are your thoughts on this new gospel?
Well, I think it's an interesting document. It's got some very interesting points. It's got 2 places where Jesus is interpreting a vision of his followers. I mean, one place the disciples seem to have a vision. They said to him, "Master, we have seen you in a vision, for we have had great dreams." And then Jesus interprets the vision of the disciples as basically as them being slayers of children, and I've got the thing in front of me. They are people of pollution and lawlessness and error and so forth. It's a violent anti-disciples attack in the process of interpreting their vision. And then Judas has a vision, and then Jesus interprets Judas's vision very favorably to Judas. This literary motif of Jesus interpreting visions, I don't remember seeing. It may exist somewhere, but I don't remember where it is. It's certainly rare to have Jesus interpreting visions of his followers. But I found that pretty interesting. In the middle of the Gospel of Judas is a summary of the secret book of John, which I thought was kind of neat. If you have a copy, you can get a copy off the internet. It's from page 47 down to page 53.
There is. Wow. I've skimmed it over.
From 47 to 53 is nothing but a summary of the secret Gospel of John.
Yeah, I have a copy.
Or at least the same ideas as, I can't say it literally, it's a summary of a particular document, but it's a summary of the basic ideas and ideology of the secret.
So it's more than safe to say that the Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic text and that it could have easily belonged in the Nag Hammadi library.
No doubt it's a Gnostic text. And somebody has suggested that maybe this was literally in the Nag Hammadi collection. And when the collection was sold, this book got separated from the others. But even if that's not true, it's certainly the same, very much the same sort of thing. And like those other books, it frankly doesn't give us much historical information of any value. I mean, we don't really learn about the first century Jesus and Judas, which, people would like to know more about this.
That's very interesting.
And why do you think the Gospel of Judas has had so much attention from the press and the general public?
Oh, it's the title. The title and the idea. When I read the Gospel of Mark, it seems to me that Mark could just as well have made Judas the hero of this Gospel. The reason is that if Jesus' purpose is to come to earth in order to suffer and die and rise again, which is what Mark's Gospel says is the thing about Jesus. That's the whole point. Judas has made it possible for him to suffer and die and rise again. And you could easily put a positive twist on it. That all the other disciples didn't understand Jesus needed to die. But Judas, he's the one who saw the truth. Now, Mark doesn't do that. But he sure could have if he wanted to twist his narrative a little bit. Well, they want to make him into a bad guy. But as I was saying, if your vision of point of Christ
that's why Matthew and Luke
be
and
delivered
John
up and suffer and be whipped and scourged and tried and convicted and suffer and die, which is what Mark thinks is the most important thing, then you've got a problem in thinking that Judas did the wrong thing. Why is it wrong to help Jesus fulfill his mission? I mean, that when the Gospel of Judas comes up and seems to imply that Judas was helping Jesus shed his physical form and return to heaven. Judas being a hero is not as crazy as it first sounds like.
We've discussed how it's possible that Gnosticism influenced the Eastern cultures, not vice versa. Do you see any Gnostic influences in Western history after its early days?
There's a religion called the Manichaeans, which seems to me to be kind of based on Zoroastrianism. But it's a religion that's separating evil matter from good spirit. And that kind of thing shows up in the Cathar movement of the European Middle Ages. But I don't really think Gnosticism is about evil matter and good spirit so much as Gnosticism is about this mythology of the descent of God into a human form. And that, I don't see that anymore. I mean, I think it may be coming back to life in the 21st century, that people are finding it a very interesting and challenging way of looking at things. But I don't know that it was around, say, in the 1700s and 1800s. I'm not sure anybody was thinking about this religion. Nowadays, it's more and more people seem to be interested. So this may be a resurgence of Gnosticism.
Like I've asked my other guests, do you see Gnosticism as a fad or maybe a movement that this time around will have enough power to stick?
A small but incremental addition of people
this time around
interested. When I went to graduate school, practically nobody had ever heard of it. Then 10 years later, most educated people had heard of it. And then gradually, as time goes on, more and more people find it interesting. But it doesn't have the fad nature of being like explosively interesting and then explosively dropped. It seems to be growing at a steady rate. And I would think that's a healthy sign for Gnosticism. That as time goes on, more and more people find it interesting. More and more people buy books about it, read about it, learn about it. So it doesn't look like a fad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I became interested in Gnosticism was, well, for example, in my earlier days when I was looking for another spiritual or a spiritual alternative, I tried all these esoteric schools of thought, Buddhism, New Age, Hinduism, but I found that Gnosticism was a better fit because it was able to lodge itself into my Western way of thinking. Other religions are very alien to somebody from the West.
In the Christian world, you're dealing with
Do you see
familiar names?
Yes, exactly.
You're dealing with the disciples. You're dealing with Jesus and John and Judas, Mary Magdalene. The idea of the cross and the idea of Pharisees and the idea of the temple. We know all this stuff. You learn all this stuff. Now, the interpretation of it, of course, is radically different.
Mary Magdalene, which gives the female people looking for spirituality.
If you try to learn a different religion, you go to Tibetan Buddhism or you go to Zen Buddhism, it's awfully to catch up to where a 12-year-old would be. You know, a 12-year-old Tibetan Buddhist probably knows more than most scholars do about their own religion. Whereas Christianity, you've already got the basics. Now, you may wish to reinterpret the basics in a Gnostic way, but that's going to be a lot more convenient and familiar to you than trying to pick up something else altogether. Absolutely. Because you can really say that here we have a tradition in American Christianity of accepting all these different denominations. There's the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and the Presbyterians and the Catholics and the Orthodox. So if you say, well, what kind of Christian are you? I'm a Gnostic Christian. That's a different social way of being than to say, what kind of person are you? Well, I've converted to Kashmir Shaivite Hinduism. Then you're just radically different than your peers. If you say I'm a Gnostic Christian, you're different, but you're not radically different. So I think that's in Gnosticism's favor as a sustainable religion.
Well, I somehow doubt that evangelical Christian or fundamental Christians will ever accept Gnosticism. But what is interesting going to the Catholic Church is I remember reading an essay. It was actually a review of the movie Stigmata, which loosely deals with the Gospel of Thomas. You can find this at Stevan Davis's website. Let me look it up. It's home.epix.net. And in this essay, you actually said that the Catholic Church really doesn't have a stance on the Gospel of Thomas. Does this still hold true?
If you want to go read the Gospel of Thomas as a scholar or as a historian, or just as an interested person, the Catholic Church just doesn't care. It's okay with that. Now, if you say, does the Catholic Church approve of the idea?
You have to worry about the Da Vinci Code.
Well, no, it doesn't. But does it disapprove of people reading this? I'd say no, they don't. This idea, the idea of the Catholic Church persecuting these lost Gospels is a fiction. A real popular fiction, but it's fiction. A Stigmata movie had that fiction. The Celestine Prophecies book had that fiction, and of course the Da Vinci Code had that fiction. But I don't know. The people who really hate the idea of Gnostic Gospels are the evangelical Protestants. If they could burn the Gospel of Thomas, they'd burn it. Whereas the Catholic Church would say, no, we can study it as a historical document. That's no problem.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you very much for being on. You've certainly given us a lot.
No, thank you.
You've got prayers.
Since your studies began on Gnosticism and ancient Christianity, is there one or two topics that you've made a radical 180-degree turn?
Well, I think one of the most surprising things to me was in my writing about the secret revelation of John, the Apocryphon of John in the book. I had just assumed that text was very negative about sexuality, human sexuality and reproduction. And I kept coming up against this passage where Adam and Eve have Seth, and he is seen as a child in their proper likeness and so forth. And it became clear to me that the text is not so much anti-sexuality and anti-reproduction as it's against sexuality when it is violent and when it is about desire and lower beliefs. So it sees the proper generation and reproduction on the model of the highest God's reproduction with the Divine Mother. The higher sphere in the Apocryphon, the cosmology is complex, but basically it goes like this, that there's a Father, Mother, Son in the highest divine sphere who are the true God, and that Adam, Eve, and Seth in the lower world represent that appropriate family, if you will, that appropriate hierarchy, and they are a mirror of the divine God. And so the Adam and Eve producing Seth is considered to be, if you will, good sex, and it's contrasted with, the bad sex that the Archons do when they rape Eve. And they produce children in their likeness, who are, Cain and Abel, who kill each other, and so on and so forth. So it's unfortunately a kind of sex that's without desire, and so that makes me less happy as a modern person.
Right, of course.
The good sex is without desire, but it's very interesting, and it took me a long time to come to see that. And the other thing that I think was pretty shocking to me is, again, that not all of these so-called heretics, are docetics. That is to say, some of them, as I said before, actually affirmed very strongly that Jesus came in the flesh, suffered and died. He had a body. It was really real. But they will even tell the story of the crucifixion and so forth, but they tell it to make a different point. They tell it to make basically two kinds of points. One, to say that, look, the rulers of this world are out to get people who are telling the truth. And so if you go out there and you preach the gospel and you tell the truth, you will be opposed, you will suffer. And you simply have to do it anyway, because that's what you're called to do. And the second thing they say is that, look, they have lied to you in telling you that you should be concerned with the things of the body and the things of the world. You need to be concerned, first of all, with the things of God and with the things of the Spirit. And the body will dissolve away. It's not who you really are. It's the Spirit who you are. And I think we've taken that very seriously as a kind of denial of the body and the importance of the body, and I think it can be read that way. But I think it could also be read as putting a focus on the spiritual life, and using then the body as a way, this attitude toward the body, not to be negative about the body, because again, like the Apocryphon of John will say, that the body's not the problem, that you can have this relationship to God even now in this world, living in the body and so forth. But what you have to do is you have to give up sinfulness. You have to turn away from the desires of the flesh and the body that lead you away from God and turn toward God. And of course, that's just a fundamental message of spirituality. And I was just very interested to see that these texts are not nearly as negative about the body as I had been led to believe, by reading the Church Fathers.
Well, Professor King,
and of course, the final thing, of course, is that we're all just terribly, terribly happy with the very positive role that women can sometimes play in this text, like Mary in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, certainly very
sorry
important.
To interrupt you again.
Oh, no, go ahead. I agree with you. That's very, very important, and one of the reasons I like some of the ancient Christians.
Dear Roberta Sparrow, I've reached the end of your book, and there's so many things that I need to ask you. Sometimes I'm afraid of what you might tell me. Sometimes I'm afraid that you'll tell me that this is not a work of fiction. I can only hope that the answers will come to me in my sleep. I hope that when the world comes to an end, I can breathe a sigh of relief, because there will be so much to look forward to.